This video describes the carbon cycle, how carbon moves between the air, water, land, and living things. We'll look at how the carbon cycle evolved to support life, how humans have disrupted it, and what we can do to help restore balance. Our story begins 2.7 billion years ago, when carbon dioxide made up over 70% of the atmosphere, where it's less than 1% today. Because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, such a high percentage made the planet very hot and uninhabitable compared to today. Just like windows in a greenhouse trap the sun's heat, so also greenhouse gases let sunlight in to warm the earth but keep heat from escaping. This is called the greenhouse gas effect. So how was most of this carbon removed from the atmosphere? It started in the oceans with the first photosynthesizers, tiny organisms like cyanobacteria, which is a type of algae, and phytoplankton. Photosynthesis is a crucial process in the carbon cycle. Using sunlight, the algae and plankton converted CO2 and water into oxygen and carbon-rich carbohydrates that were stored in the bodies of plankton. The oxygen was first absorbed by oceans and land, before some eventually moved into the air. Meanwhile, the carbon stored in the plankton eventually sank to the ocean floor where they died, locking away carbon in sediment layers. In this way, over a period of billions of years, photosynthesis kept lowering atmospheric CO2 and raising oxygen levels, making the planet cooler and paving the way for complex life. By about 500 million years ago, CO2 had dropped to less than 1% of the atmosphere, though its concentration was still more than 20 times higher than today, and Earth was over 10 degrees Celsius hotter. This is when plant and animal life developed, a key point in the carbon cycle because now plants could join in the work of photosynthesis. It started with mosses colonizing the harsh landscapes, pulling CO2 from the air, releasing oxygen and creating carbohydrates and organic matter that eventually became soil. As plant life expanded, so too did animals, another essential part of the cycle. They ate carbon-rich plants, breathed out CO2, and returned carbon to the soil when they died, thus completing the cycle. After millions more years, vast forests emerged and flourished. Trees pulled huge amounts of carbon from the air, and when they died, their remains formed 90% of the world's coal deposits. Meanwhile, the buried layers of carbon sediments from dead algae and plankton were undergoing another transition. With heat, pressure, and lots of time, these sediments slowly turned into oil and natural gas. In this way, almost all of the oil and natural gas that we use today was formed in the last 500 million years. By 300 million years ago, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere had dropped to just 110 parts per million. That's less than 25% of today's levels. With a reduced greenhouse effect, Earth rapidly cooled and entered one of its longest and coldest ice ages. Then, around 250 million years ago, CO2 rose again, this time to levels about 5 times higher than today. Temperatures rose more than 10 degrees, helping to trigger Earth's largest mass extinction. 96% of species vanished. After this, CO2 levels fluctuated some more, contributing to cycles of ice ages and warm periods, and oxygen levels eventually stabilized at 21%. For the past 800,000 years, the amount of CO2 in the air has stayed between 200 and 300 parts per million, a stable range that supported rich biodiversity and the arrival of Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago. In the 10,000 years prior to the Industrial Revolution, the carbon cycle was in balance. Oceans absorbed and emitted about 54 billion tons of carbon each year. Land ecosystems were also in balance, absorbing and emitting roughly 113 billion tons. This balance helped maintain one of the most stable climate periods in Earth's history, conditions for human life to flourish. Whereas it took billions of years to create these balanced conditions, it took humankind just a few hundred years to disrupt them. Our biggest disruption has been our use of fossil fuels. On average, in the 2010s, each year we took about 9.4 billion tons of carbon from long-term storage underground and released it into the atmosphere, mostly through coal, gas, and oil. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've burned around 500 billion tons of this ancient carbon. We released another 1.6 billion tons each year by disrupting the land, by clear-cutting forests, building cities, and agricultural practices like tilling that remove carbon from soil. Mother Nature does her best to keep up and restore balance. Oceans absorb an extra 2.5 billion tons of carbon from the air, and land ecosystems absorb another 3.4 billion tons. But that still leaves 5.1 billion tons of carbon added to the air every year, carbon that nature can't reabsorb fast enough. Altogether, since the Industrial Revolution, we've increased atmospheric CO2 by over 50%, from 280 to over 420 parts per million. That's the highest it's been in 14 million years, and it's already raised global temperatures by more than 1 degree Celsius. Why do we emit so much carbon? It's mostly because of how our economies and businesses meet our daily demands related to food, shelter, clothing, and transportation. About 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our food systems, which includes using chemicals and machinery to grow food, transporting and manufacturing processed food, and the fact that about 1/3 of the world's food is wasted. For example, the average American wastes 25% of the food they bring home from the grocery store. 15% of global emissions come from how we raise animals for food. Another 15% of greenhouse gas emissions come from our homes, including their construction, heating and cooling, and eventually tearing them down. Even though the number of people per household is decreasing, the average American home has increased in size by 250% since 1950, with larger houses requiring more energy to build, heat, and cool. The fashion industry is responsible for around 10% of global emissions. Half of those come from fast fashion, cheap clothing made quickly and in large quantities. Clothing relies on fossil fuels for synthetic fabrics, clear-cutting forests or soil degradation for cotton farms, and long-distance shipping. In the US, people buy an average of 58 new pieces of clothing a year, many worn just a few times before being thrown away. Finally, over 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from driving and manufacturing our personal cars. Despite being especially high emitters, SUVs are more popular than ever. Together, these everyday issues of consumption, how we eat, live, dress, and move around, account for about 65% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They are shaped by the economic systems we live in, but also by our individual choices and habits. Happily, there's a lot we can do to restore balance to the carbon cycle and safeguard human flourishing. Generally, this means changing how economies, businesses, and lifestyles are powered by transitioning to renewable energy sources like wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal. Equally important is enhancing carbon removal by planting trees, reducing deforestation for agriculture, and restoring ecosystems through land regeneration practices. But beyond switching our energy sources, a deeper shift is needed. Rethinking our lifestyles and consumption habits. If we want to avoid the worst climate outcomes, by 2030, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% of 2019 levels, and by over 80% by 2050. Let's look at some of the specific things we can do. We can cut emissions by simply wasting less food, by planning meals, storing food properly, and eating leftovers. Eating less industrial-produced meat, especially beef, also makes a big impact. When you can, purchase your food from local farmers who use regenerative practices that help store carbon in the soil. Next, smaller and energy-efficient homes can drastically reduce heating, cooling, and powering needs. Actions like turning down the thermostat, sealing drafts, and switching to efficient appliances or clean energy sources make a real difference. Supporting net zero and green renovation and construction companies also helps. When it comes to clothing, buying fewer, better quality items and keeping them longer can slash the carbon footprint of our wardrobes. Choosing organic fabrics, shopping secondhand, or supporting local brands also reduces the carbon load. The goal of the slow fashion movement isn't to stop buying clothes, it's to buy more thoughtfully and waste less. Lastly, walking, biking, and using public transit are some of the lowest emission ways to travel. If you really need a car, choose a smaller electric one, try to carpool, or join a car share co-op. Taken together, individual choices and changes in the way we eat, live, dress, and move could reduce our 65% share of global emissions by more than half. These changes aren't just good for the planet, they often save money, improve health, and reconnect us with what truly matters. In sum, over billions of years, the carbon cycle has created conditions where, for the past hundreds of thousands of years, human life could flourish because the atmosphere was kept at around 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide. However, what we have done to increase emissions has disrupted this balance, risking ice ages, extinctions, and new climates that do not foster human flourishing. What role will you play in restoring balance to our planet?